Hey everyone, my name is Eric Manning, and you're listening to the Is Jesus Alive podcast, the podcast where we talk about arguments and evidence for the Christian worldview. And I have a very special treat for you guys. I am talking today with Michael Jones of Inspiring Philosophy. Inspiring Philosophy is one of the best Christian apologetics YouTube channels that's out there. He has over 100,000 subscribers. He has content on all kinds of great topics regarding Christian theology and apologetics, and has been doing this for about 7 years. One of the things that I really like about his channel is that it's always just extremely well researched, but it's just well pleasing to the eye. His videos are just really fun to watch, and it's one of those channels where you just have to hit subscribe and get notifications, because every time he comes out with a new video, you're gonna come away with something new that you've learned. And so we're going to be talking about a video series that he has upcoming. He has 3 videos coming out regarding the subject of whether or not there is polytheism in the Bible. Now, skeptics will say that there is, and that the ancient Israelites, like their Canaanite neighbors, worship many gods. Now, we know that they did worship other idols and did synchronize different things, but they'll just say that this was the normal course of things, and that Yahweh is not really any more special than the other gods. It was only later into the Babylonian captivity, when they were trying to make sense of what went wrong, did they make this radical conversion to monotheism. So I'm going to be throwing a few of these atheistic objections and these skeptical objections at Michael, and he's going to be answering those as well as giving us the case for monotheism. And so just thank you so much for listening, and let's jump right into the interview. Thanks for being on the show with me.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, definitely. So you told me that you're working on an upcoming video regarding whether or not there's polytheism in the Bible. So what got you interested into digging into that subject?
It's probably a long journey. I think what first may have actually got me interested was years ago, maybe back in like 2011, as I was debating with atheists on Facebook before I even started my channel. And someone sent me that really bad video by that atheist YouTuber called Evidence, spelled with 2 3s. And he's not active on YouTube anymore, but he had this video called A History of God. And I watched it and I was like, you gotta be kidding me. It was like the arguments were not really that good. And it was coming from a book called A History of God. And they were trying to argue that originally, like, their biblical authors used to be polytheistic, and then during the Josiah reforms or during the Babylonian exile, they changed everything, and that's when they made it monotheistic. So it's just been a long journey. I spent a lot of time on YouTube doing other subjects because there were other things I wanted to address as well, and I'm finally getting to this subject because this is another subject I've wanted to address for a long time.
Okay, I got you. I've heard a few of these things too, but like not a whole lot. And so most of the attacks you kind of see are more on the New Testament than maybe the Old Testament. Go ahead.
One of the things you have to think about that, though, is a lot of atheists or a lot of non-Christians almost just assume this without much thought to it. Like Bart Ehrman's is obviously not his specialty, but he has said in passing, like, well, obviously, it was the oldest Canaanites or oldest Israelites, that is, whoever the Israelites descended from, were polytheistic, and he changed it to monotheistic. And so if you talk to a lot of atheists or skeptics online, they almost just kind of assume it too. For some reason, when I've encountered a lot of skeptics, this is just the default assumption. And I was talking to a Assyriologist. His name is Mark Chavalas. And he basically said, like, a lot of scholars do just assume it. It's like this old idea from Hegel, the philosopher from the 1800s, where we just sort of assume that culture slowly evolved this way and to arrive at monotheism, which is a late development.
Right. So what are the biblical arguments that they use? I mean, where are they getting these assumptions, and just where does this stuff come from?
Well, I think for one, starting, and it's not a bad assumption. Let's be fair. The more I've read on this, the more I'm trying to understand the other side of the view. And in the past couple months, I've been in communication with scholars. Like I said, I've been in communication with Mark Chavalas, another guy named Chris Hansen, John Walton, numerous other scholars on this, Mark Smith as well, trying to get an idea of that view. One of the basic views is, one of the basic arguments is that if you go back far enough in time, there weren't monotheists. There weren't many monotheists. The biblical authors would have been the exception in the ancient Near East. Every culture back then was polytheistic. So then they say, well, it's likely that all the cultures in Canaan and around Canaan would have been polytheistic as well. And monotheism would have just developed later, going back to like the Bronze Age and the Middle Bronze Age and further back. So that's kind of what a lot of scholars sort of assume, is that if you're going to look further back in time, there's a lot less monotheists than there is today. So that's probably the way it was, and then monotheism sort of evolved and slowly evolved out of this idea. So that's the first argument you tend to get. And it's not a bad assumption. The problem is that we still do have the biblical account, and we also have anomalies as well, like, of course, Akhenaten's revolution. For those who don't know, there was a heretic pharaoh of Egypt in the late Bronze Age named Akhenaten, who tried to wipe out the polytheism of Egypt and establish a monotheistic religion around the Aten, which was the sun disk that the god Ra sort of manifested himself as. So there was a little bit of monotheism back then, but the overwhelming majority obviously wasn't. And so then scholars look at the biblical account and they go, well, is there any remnants of polytheism left in these texts? And what they tend to do is they mainly rely on two passages. That'd be Deuteronomy 32, 8-9, and Psalm 82.
Right. And I've seen a few of those like arguments floating around, and there's other passages that they'll throw out there. Now, one of the things that I've heard kind of along with what you were saying is they'll say like El was the original head of like the Canaanite pantheon, and then Yahweh was like Israelites kind of God, but they worshiped other gods among them. And then eventually they were just kind of fused into one God, and the rest of the pantheon just received like a demotion. And so like, is there any evidence for these weird claims? And, you know, why don't they work in your view?
Well, I mean, of course there is evidence. I was talking about Deuteronomy 32. And if you just read verses 8-9, I'm going to read it as best I can to sort of represent the original language.
Yeah.
When the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, he divided mankind. He fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of El. But Yahweh's portion is his people, Jacob his allotted heritage. Now, if you just hear that in English, you go, okay, you have the Most High, and he's dividing nations to all these sons of El. And then you hear Yahweh gets a portion, who is Jacob. And so a lot of scholars look at that and go, okay, well, this is an early remnant of ancient polytheism, when the ancient authors thought there was a distinction between El and Yahweh, and El sort of divides the nations up, gives, Moab to Chemosh. Maybe he'll give like the Egyptian gods Egypt, and then for Jacob, Israel, he gets Israel. And so a lot of scholars will say this is a remnant of that. Now, the problem is that if you look at it in its original language, so if you were to go back and you were to look at actually what it says, it doesn't necessarily say that. So there's a scholar named Otto Eichfeld who takes this view, but he says, the author of the song, it is true, when speaking of Yahweh's relationship to his people, avoids probably intentionally the application of the hitherto used active verbal form, and so does not say directly that the Most High gave Israel or Jacob to Yahweh as his portion, but is content to establish the fact that Israel has become the property of Yahweh. So scholars like Michael Heiser point out the way you can read this verse is quite simply that when the Most High, who was Yahweh, gave up the nations to other lesser deities, he then established his own people, who is Jacob or Israel. And that fits quite well with the surrounding context, the entire chapter. And so even as Mark Smith notes, the original author probably was a monotheist who was just sort of taking this old polytheistic idea of the high god El dividing up the nations. And he's just sort of reinterpreting it, saying, well, that was Yahweh that divided the nations up. And then he created his own people, which is us. So when you actually look at the grammar of this and the surrounding context, I don't think the argument really works. I think people are sort of taking these two verses out and going and running a little wild with it. And even Mark Smith, who does agree that, who actually does think that there used to be a distinction between El and Yahweh, he doesn't think the author of this poem in Deuteronomy 32 meant or intended any polytheism.
Yeah, and there's other verses too I've seen him throw out there, like Psalm 89. I mean, you mentioned Psalm 82. Psalm 89 is another one where it'll say, the heavens praise your wonders, Yahweh, your faithfulness too in the assembly of the holy ones. For who in the skies can compare above with the Lord Yahweh? Who is like Yahweh among the heavenly beings? In the council of the holy ones, El is greatly feared. He's awesome, more awesome than all those that surround him. And so one of the things that I've seen just doing a little research for this interview is skeptics will just say that, like, well, if Yahweh were just this single all-powerful deity, then like what's the point that the psalmist is trying to make to suggest that he's superior than all these other heavenly beings? It's like, is he insecure? Like, is this insecurity suggest some sort of past rivalry? And just who are these other heavenly beings that like these passages are referring to? And so what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think people are like that video I mentioned earlier by evidence. They're sort of jumping the gun. Of course, the Bible acknowledges other divine beings. The New Testament does it well. In fact, the New Testament says one of them is a god. He's the god of this world, who's Satan. Right. In fact, remember when Jesus is taken up on the mountain by Satan? Satan offers him all the kingdoms of the world. Okay, he couldn't do that if he didn't already have access to them. Right. So obviously Satan was some sort of other divine being who sort of had territorial rule outside of Israel. That's the implication in that passage. So obviously the Bible recognizes there are other divine beings out there. We have now in the New Testament period have reduced them all to either angels or demons. That wasn't the case in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, there was either a 4-tier or a 3-tier level of divine beings. I tend to take the 3-tier view. And I use the analogy for the nerds out there of Lord of the Rings. If you know anything about the mythology of Lord of the Rings, there is one god who is the creator, eternal of all things, named Eru Elivatar. Yeah. And then he creates 15 lesser spiritual beings called the Valar. And then beneath them, he creates another set of spiritual beings called the Maiar. And you know Gandalf from Lord of the Rings, he's a Maiar spirit. And you don't really hear about the Valar. They're sort of off doing their own thing through the whole series. So that's kind of the way it is in the Bible. You have Yahweh who's at the top, and he creates sort of like this divine council. These other beings who are sort of like beneath him, who he's got relationships with, he works with, but they all answer to him. He's all in charge. All power is manifested in him. Then beneath them, you have spirits that we would call angels. So what we tend to think of is in the divine realm is we think there is God and then there was just angels. But in the Old Testament, it's more like God, then the divine council, then the angels. And you see that kind of throughout the biblical texts.
Right, yeah. So for our listeners, I'm sorry if you haven't read the Silmarillion, but maybe you just watched the movies. And so, but that, the nerd in me got what you were picking up, what you were laying down there. So
I'm sure a lot of our followers will get what I'm picking up on. I don't think we have a lot of followers who have not read Lord of the Rings. Yeah. I have never asked one of my followers about Lord of the Rings, and they have never said, I've never heard of that.
Right. And so, yeah, no, that is a really good illustration, and that does make a lot of sense. And so you have this one all-powerful God. It's not just like this one tribal deity that maybe the Israelites just kind of picked, and this is our favorite God. He's the one who created everything over and above all these other created beings, these other divine council members who are like these spiritual beings. You're saying that obviously Yahweh is the one who created them and is above all of them.
Yeah, and if you want a really good illustration, go to 1 Kings 22. This is prophet Micah gives this prophecy over the corrupt King Ahab. And he says, he saw Yahweh sitting on his throne and the host of heaven standing beside him on his right and on his left. And Yahweh said, who will entice Ahab that he may go down and fall at Ramoth Gilead? And one said one thing and another said another. And then one spirit came forward and stood before Yahweh saying, I will entice him. So you sort of see God in his divine counsel in this passage. That's 1 Kings 22. And he sort of is like talking with the members of the council. Now, obviously, this doesn't imply God does not understand these types of things, for the same reason that when God asked Cain, where is your brother? He doesn't know where Cain, he's not like going, by the way, what happened to your brother Abel? It's not what he's doing. He's trying to, it's a relationship building technique. It's the same thing I do with my children. I may know when she did something bad, but I'm still going to ask her because I'm building relationships.
Right. I got you. So this sounds a little bit similar to the view you mentioned Michael Heiser earlier. And I know his books are really popular, especially The Unseen Realm. I haven't read that one. I did read Supernatural, though. Would you say that your views are similar to Heiser's view? And
Yeah, on this I do agree with Heiser. I disagree with him on what the Nephilim were, but that's another topic for another time.
yeah, and for those of you, Michael does have a video. Just go to Inspiring Philosophy, and there is a video on the Nephilim, which is a different take than Heiser has. But so you would say that you guys are pretty much in agreement as far as like with the divine council and all that, though, correct?
Oh, absolutely. I think he hits the nail on the head in terms of that. And I appreciate what he's doing with that, because a lot of Christians, it sort of goes over their head. And then what a lot of atheists do is they use that sort of to evidence, to sort of create this polytheistic view of the Old Testament. And then a lot of people fall prey to that. But if you understand monotheistic divine council theology throughout the biblical text, this isn't an issue.
Right, right. Okay, well, that definitely helps clarify things for me, having read the book. And for those of you who are listening, I think Unseen Realm, I haven't read all of it yet, but I did read Supernatural, and it's a very light and easy read. You can pick it up on Kindle for like $6. I'm not getting anything to promote it, but I will leave it in the show notes for those listening. It is definitely worth picking up and very thought-provoking. Even if you don't agree with all of it, it's worth kind of eating the proverbial hay and spitting out the sticks, so to speak.
Yeah.
And so
in a nutshell, what Heiser is basically arguing is he goes back to the Tower of Babel incident. And that's when he gets sick of the nations and he divorces them. He gives them to lesser deities. Mm-hmm. This is alluded to in Psalm 82. It's what's taught, he argues, is happening in Deuteronomy 32. He divides the nation up to lesser deities. And then he creates his own people who he's going to use to bless the world. Then when you get to Acts, you have Pentecost. And that is supposed to be God sending out the mission to reclaim the nations. Mm-hmm. You have all these different people representing Jewish people from different nations that have been spread out, and they have become Christians at Pentecost. And so now God is sending them out to sort of reclaim the nations. So at Babel, God divorces the nations, sets up his own people he's going to use to work through to sort of bless the world. He does that, and when the atonement is made, he then sends them back out to reclaim the nations.
Right, and these seem to be Paul, what he's referring to when he's talking about principalities and powers and different things like that, correct?
Right. It's a spiritual warfare kind of going on. It's a territorial game. Yahweh's territory was within Israel. And after the resurrection, a new campaign is launched. It's sort of like an offensive campaign to sort of reclaim the nations from these lesser deities that would be ruling under Satan in the spiritual realm. And it makes sense in terms of the overall aim of Scripture and what it's trying to say.
Yeah, I would say so for sure. Now, one of the things I have seen skeptics say that do hold to this, well, the Bible's polytheistic and Yahweh's just one other tribal deity, is they would just say that if there is an all good God, why would he pick just one group of people? That just seems totally arbitrary and kind of immoral. Like he's just showing this favoritism. And they'll say things like it just supports this view that Yahweh is just this tribal God, and he's in some sense even limited in certain areas that I'll get into in another question in a moment. But it just seems, they'll argue that it fits more with a polytheistic background versus our traditional understanding of monotheism, of just this like most perfect being. And so what are your thoughts on that? Like, how would you respond to that?
Well, first, let's ask that question. Did God sort of forget about literally everyone else and just focus on Israel? I would argue no. And there might actually be a lot of evidence to that in anthropology. Now, I'll put a pin in that for now. I'm going to probably do a video on that in March. I'm just sort of crossing all my T's and dotting my I's right now to make sure that's all ironed out well. But that might not be the case. There might be evidence in other cultures, whatever, that could correlate with that. But that's really not what God is doing with Israel. You see this in Isaiah. You see this in Genesis as well, that God is going to use Abraham, the children of Israel, to bless the nations of the world. God has not forgotten about the nations he divorced. He's going to bring them back into the kingdom. It's just they need to go. It needs to be done in the right way and in the right timing. And so that needs to be understood within regards to the overall aim of Scripture. It's not that God has sort of forgotten about these nations. In fact, God is quite loving to other nations. I mean, just look at the book of Jonah. He sends Jonah out of Israel to go to Nineveh to preach to them so that they can repent. And if you notice how Jonah ends, the city of Nineveh doesn't sign a covenant with God. they kind of just like, repent, and then they go about doing whatever they were doing. And God just simply has mercy on them. He doesn't want to destroy them. He wants to give them any chance they possibly can to repent. And you see other examples of this in Scripture, of these different Gentiles coming to worship God. Like there's stuff in First Kings as well, someone coming to Elijah. And so there's all these interesting examples as well. In fact, the prophet Elijah may very well even have been a Gentile. It calls him a Tishbit. It says that's who he was. And that's another word synonymous with maybe a foreigner. Now, there is a little controversial about that, but there are a lot of scholars who actually think that the prophet Elijah was a foreigner who was living as a sojourn in Israel, and he became a prophet.
Right. And it's interesting that like Jesus specifically calls the fact out that these prophets, Elijah or Elisha, I forget which one, was specifically sent to a Gentile woman, like in that particular area. And then he also talks about like Naaman the Syrian was like the only one who got healed. I believe this is in Luke 4. And so you're right. It doesn't seem like he's forgotten them at all. And so that's definitely a good point.
No, I think it's God realizing that the nations have sort of abandoned him. He divorces them. So now this is the way humanity is. It's totally depraved. So he starts a new plan to sort of bring humanity back into the kingdom. And it's going to take a while because of the psychological nature of humanity. This isn't something that's just going to happen overnight. And I think that's what a lot of skeptics don't understand, is they try to divorce the biblical text from biblical theology, divorce it from human psychology. And when you're arguing from the biblical account, you've got to take a full scope of the picture to get an understanding of what's happening.
Right, exactly. And so one of the other things that I've heard is they'll say that not only is Yahweh limited in sort of like this goodness, but he'll be limited in his power. And one of the scriptures that I saw that they'll use for that is 2 Kings 3:26-27. Again, this whole tribalistic motif that they will throw out there. They'll talk about that the prophet Elisha predicted that the Israelites would defeat the Moabites. And during the battle that followed, Mesha, the king of Moab, sacrificed his son to Chemosh or Chemosh. I don't know how to pronounce that.
Chemosh, yeah.
Chemosh, yeah. And so the text says that the king of Moab took his firstborn son, offered him as a sacrifice, and then following this, the Moabites defeated the Israelites, and the fury of Israel was great, and they withdrew. And so what they'll try and say is like, well, this is one where Chemosh really stuck it to Yahweh. And it just illustrates that he's just one of many divine authorities, but not like the all-powerful one. And so what do you make of like skeptics throwing out scriptures like that to prove that kind of point?
Yeah, I mean, this is once again reading too much into a passage that isn't there. You see the same with Judges 119 or Psalm 82 or Deuteronomy 32. They try to read more that's actually there. And let's remember what the actual passage says. So Elisha gives this prophecy, and it actually says they went forward, striking the Moabites as they went, and they overthrew the cities and every good piece of land. So it is true that the prophecy that Elijah gave them was actually unfolding. God was with them. They were overthrowing the cities and winning. It does not say that Chemosh defeated Yahweh. It does not say that they sort of that the Moabites overthrew and defeated them. What it actually says in verse 27 of this passage, it says that, and there came great wrath against Israel, and they withdrew from him and returned to their own land. Now that's the most important thing. It just says they retreated. Now, so what happens is Mesha gets up there, sacrifices his son, and then this idea of wrath from Chemosh comes upon Israel. And what does Israel do? They just withdraw and leave. Now, there was no battle with Chemosh actually fought, or with the Moabites at their main city. Israel just kind of got scared and left. What is one of the main themes we see throughout the book of Kings and 2 Kings is that Yahweh tells Israel to do something. He says, trust me, have faith in me, you'll win. And they don't. They get scared of other gods, or they chase after other gods. It's the exact same thing happening here. There's a great paper by George M. Harton called The Meaning of 2 Kings 3:27. So the title is The Meaning of 2 Kings 3:27. And he points out that what's basically happening is Israel is not trusting God here. They got the prophecy from Elijah. They should have trusted him. But what happens is they get to the city, they see this king sacrifice his son, and they get scared, and they get scared of their god Chemosh. So they were more afraid of Chemosh than they were of trusting of Yahweh, and they withdrew. So it's another blunder on Israel's part. They just they didn't trust God. The text does not say they fought against Moab and Moab defeated them and overthrew them. No, it just says Israel got scared and left. So there was no battle that actually fought. Israel was just terrified of another deity, like they are throughout the rest of the text. They just don't get it. They don't know how to trust God.
Right. They're just having a Goliath moment in a way.
Exactly.
Yeah. So very good. That definitely answers a lot of the questions that I've seen so far. I'm more of a New Testament guy, so a lot of these things are a bit new to me. They don't sound right, obviously, but it's not something that I've looked at. And so I definitely appreciate the expertise here. And it sounds like you've really obviously dug into what a lot of these scholars are saying about this. And so now one of the other things, and you brought it up earlier, is they'll say that like during the 7th century, about when Isaiah was prophesying, and you definitely see it, from Isaiah 40 on, this really big theme of monotheism. And they'll say things like, well, that was during Isaiah's time, and even parts of Deuteronomy were written much later, and they were kind of interpreting their captivity in Babylon and trying to figure out like what went wrong. And they just kind of had this idea like, yes, monotheism, or like we've had it all wrong to this point, and this is why we're in trouble. And so what do you make of this odd sounding reinterpretation of scripture?
Well, it doesn't make sense. I mean, so let's get this straight. You have a bunch of polytheists in Canaan. They're polytheists through and out. They have their own cultic deity that's supposed to be a part of their own land, who's Yahweh. And then they get defeated, and they're taken into exile. Okay, typically, if you look at what Mark Smith or Christine Hayes says, when this happened, defeated people would trade their defeated gods for the conquering gods, or they would synchronize. Because the way the ancient people thought about these things is that if their god lost in a battle, well, it meant that, or if they lost in a battle, it meant their god also lost in a divine realm. Well, different tribes were fighting in the ancient world. There was also a divine war happening in the spiritual level between the gods themselves. And so when Babylon won, that looked like Marduk actually defeated Yahweh in the divine realm. And so the people would simply go, well, our God got defeated. I guess we should, worship the God who's actually the victor. And that's what we see for a lot of these people. Or they would do something like what the Assyrians did, is they just sort of synchronized their head deity, Asher, with Marduk. I mean, that makes more sense. Just say, oh, the reason why we lost is because we're both worshiping the same deity, just by different names, and he just liked you guys more. But, we'll shape up and get our act together, and that'll be fine. The Jews don't do this, and that's peculiar. Why aren't they trading the defeated God for the victorious God, or why aren't they just synchronizing? Well, they're an anomaly. The Jewish people in Babylon proclaimed Yahweh is greater than Marduk even after that. He was somehow already in charge, already far better, and you guys just don't get it. Well, that just seems like an anomaly. It would make far more sense if they were already monotheistic, worshiping who they thought was the creator. And they would just have to and so when they go into exile, they go, well, how did the creator obviously can't lose, so what really happened? So it makes far more sense for them to understand it, because if they were just another polytheistic culture, they would have went along with the cultural norm and just traded deities. But again, that's not really what happened. So when they say this, when they sort of say that, oh, this was sort of their reply to sort of deal with the defeat of losing to Babylon, it doesn't really fit with the culture. That's not what you did in that state. What you actually did was you traded a deity or you synchronized a deity. So why is Yahweh not being synchronized? Why is he still considered to be creator? Well, I would argue it makes far more sense. They were hearkening back, as they said, to an ancient covenant they already had with who they thought the creator was.
Yeah, definitely. It makes a whole lot more sense. These are the main objections that I've seen thrown out there, and I've just taken those and just thrown them at you, and it makes a lot of sense as far as how these objections just really don't work. Just kind of in a nutshell, give me your case for monotheism in the Bible, as far as just being that overarching theme versus just this view.
Well, let's start with, let me give you two arguments. How about we do that?
Sure.
Let's start with one that I found fascinating. In fact, when I first read this, I thought it had to be mistaken. It just seemed too weird. So language is more primitive or older than a culture. So language is older than a culture. So Roland Devaux says, language is more conservative than custom, and Hebrew retains several traces of that. For example, generations after the conquest, a house was still called a tent, and not only in poetry, but also in everyday speech. Disbanded soldiers that return, they would say, every man return to his tent. Okay, again, to express leaving early in the morning, a verb is often used which meant to load the beast of burden. So Israel's language, Hebrew, retained this ancient nomadic structure. And you can kind of see the same thing in English. We say, I'm going to write an email. We're not really going to write an email. We're going to type out an email, but we say write because, a couple decades ago, we were writing letters and mailing them. Now we still say write an email. So language is older than the customs and the culture. So once we've established that, there is no Hebrew word for goddess. There is no Ella, Elia, Elaho. They don't have a word for goddess. And it's weird because there are times they could have used it, like in 1 Kings 11:33, when they are talking about Asherah. 1 Kings 11:5 as well. They don't, but one of their closest cultural parallels, the city of Ugarit, does have a word for goddess, and they were polytheistic, no one doubts that. So why doesn't Hebrew have a word for goddess? Well, it makes more sense if they started out monotheistic under the days of Moses, and then only slowly, gradually became polytheistic as they integrated with Canaan, as the biblical account says. So that's one of the things that was really weird. When I first read it, I thought it had to be mistaken. Like, what language doesn't have a word for goddess? Well, apparently Hebrew doesn't. That was something that came much later. So I would say that makes far more sense with the idea they were originally monotheistic and then later sort of integrated and started worshiping the Asherahs and Baals and became polytheistic. That actually fits far more with that anomaly there.
Right.
Another issue, the second argument I'll bring up, is they'll try to say like, oh, well, in the earliest records, you can see this sort of distinction between Yahweh and El. And there's really no place in the Bible that happens. Even in very early poetry, like some of the very earliest poetry, like Numbers 23, Numbers, Psalm 29, Psalm 24, Yahweh is still kind of spoken of as sort of like this most high God. So Numbers 23 is a prophecy given by Balaam. And grammatically, it's very old. But in verses 8 and in verses 21 and 22, Yahweh and El are directly equated as the same deity. Verse 8 says, how can I curse El? How can I curse whom El has not cursed? How can I denounce whom Yahweh has not denounced? So Yahweh is their God. Yahweh, their God, is wisdom. El brings them up out of Egypt. The author seems to be equating Yahweh and El very early on. So going back to the very early stuff, Yahweh and El are equated as one. And if you go to the very late stuff, I'm talking like Second Temple period, the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is when monotheism was supposed to have wiped everything out. Well, the ironic thing is even in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we still see a lot of the divine council theology, that thing I was mentioning earlier.
Yeah.
About, and so, well, some scholars will say, well, that was all wiped out of the Bible and done away with. But why is it in the Dead Sea Scrolls?
Right.
If it was supposed to be done away with. I mean, we see it constantly in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Like they talk about the assembly of El there. They talk about the high council of El. And it's not always talking about angels. It's actually talking about the divine council.
Right. No, that's really good. And so when is this video going to be dropping?
Well, I'm going to be doing 3 videos on monotheism. One will be in January, one in February, one in March.
Excellent. Awesome. And so now for those of you guys who don't know, it's Inspiring Philosophy YouTube. I'm sure if you're listening to this, you probably do know, because Michael has definitely made his name very well known in apologetic circles. And if you're not supporting him on Patreon, you do the early access. Is that right, Michael?
I do early access, and I'm probably going to start doing live Q&As for donors, maybe monthly, maybe every other month. We'll see. Okay.
Well, help this man go full time and get the early access, because you're going to want to see these videos as they drop. Lots of really good.
They're going to be long. The first one's like 40 minutes. There's a lot of data to go over.
No, long form's good. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. I feel like a lot of the YouTube responses a lot of the apologetics on YouTube, and this is one of the things that I appreciate about you, is your stuff is always evergreen. A lot of this just kind of replying to things as they happen. They definitely have their place, and I appreciate the people that do those like a lot. But the thing I like about your videos is it doesn't matter if they're 7 years old or they just came out. There's something that you could always watch 5 or 10 years from now, or however long, they're still going to be relevant. So now, what are some good materials? Like, say somebody wants to learn more about this. in the meantime, what are books or materials or things that you might recommend people get their hands on?
I would start, as we talked about Heiser. Heiser's one of the main advocates about this. He's written a lot of papers on this issue. If you just look up him on Deuteronomy 32, 18, you'll get papers. His dissertation covers this a little as well, back from 2004. You can always read The Unseen Realm. It's in there as well. Those are good places to start. And then if you want to go a little further, check out Mark Smith, his book called God in Translation. That's a little bit more deeper. I don't agree with everything he says in there, but it's a pretty good book. You could read In Search of God by Trygve Mediger is also a very good book. He argues for other anomalies in the Hebrew text that I'll be using in one of my videos. There's another book on anomalies and the difference between the biblical world and the other worlds of the ancient Near East. It's called, it's by John Walton. It's, It's Ancient Near Eastern Thought in the Old Testament. Those are some good places to start in terms of that. And I also recommend you read some more of the skeptical scholars as well, like James Anderson, Sean Flynn, John Day, Simon Parker. These are the guys who are arguing that, the biblical texts were originally polytheistic and later redacted and changed, just to get their arguments. And just quite honestly, I remember I read, there was a scholar named Chris Hansen, who sent me a bunch of books over the summer. And I sat down and read them. And after I was done reading them, I felt more confident that the biblical authors were never polytheistic, because the arguments just didn't stick. They were not that convincing. So that's that was the final straw that made me say I'm going full forward with this series on monotheism now.
I think I know which Chris you're referring to. And so, yeah,
he's a very intelligent guy. He sends me a lot of really good resources, and so I appreciate that.
Yeah, definitely. So, well, awesome, man. Well, I really appreciate you being on the show, and yeah, this has been just really good stuff. Something to definitely go back and chew on, and I can't wait for the videos. They sound like they're going to be just really thorough and well researched as always. And so, thank you so much for joining me on the show today, Michael.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.